asked me a few years ago what the biggest threat to my emotional well-being would be, I probably would have said something dramatic: nuclear war, a constitutional crisis, or perhaps the inevitable day someone finally convinces the internet that pineapple belongs on every single food item, including breakfast cereal. I would not have guessed the answer would be a loaf of bread, and yet, here we are. Everywhere you look, people are talking about inflation. Not in that fun, look, my favourite baseball card doubled in value kind of way. No, this is the much less exciting version where your grocery bill quietly empties your wallet while smiling politely about it. Suddenly, every headline sounded like it had been written by someone trying far too hard to make economics exciting. Lunchflation, boozerflation, milkflation, meatflation. Let's stop right there. Meatflation isn't an economic term. It sounds like something a teenage boy would desperately hope never appears in his search history. Whoever approved that word should probably spend some time thinking about the choices that led them to this moment. Honestly, we've reached a point where every inconvenience gets turned into a catchy buzzword. If toothpaste tubes get smaller, shrinkflation. If cereal boxes lose 3 handfuls of cereal, shrinkflation. If your favourite chocolate bar suddenly contains more wrapper than chocolate, also shrinkflation. Eventually, we'll have words like chairflation, where furniture companies simply remove one leg and insist it's minimalist. The point is, prices were climbing everywhere, food had jumped, electricity had jumped, gasoline had practically launched itself into orbit. At one point, I honestly wondered whether it would be cheaper to start refining gasoline in my own kitchen every morning instead of buying it at the pump. Granted, there are several reasons not to do that. The biggest being that your neighbours tend to dislike homemade oil refineries. Still, people were feeling the squeeze. You could see it everywhere, at grocery stores, at gas stations, in restaurants, on utility bills. Even companies that didn't want customers noticing higher prices had figured out another strategy. Instead of charging more, they simply gave you less. It was one of the sneakiest tricks in modern business. Keep the price exactly the same. Just quietly shrink the product. It's the commercial equivalent of inviting 8 people over for dinner and serving 7 chicken nuggets. Technically, nothing changed. Emotionally, everything changed. There was one consumer advocate who had become something of a celebrity because he'd spent years documenting exactly this phenomenon. He'd hold up 2 packages that looked identical. Then he'd explain that one used to contain 32 ounces, while the new one contained only 28. The company claimed the bottle had been redesigned to make it easier to hold. Sure, and I'm sure airlines remove legroom because they care deeply about passenger flexibility. According to him, everything seems smaller now. Toothpaste, breakfast cereal, sports drinks, products still proudly wore labels like family size. Even after losing several ounces, apparently the family had simply become smaller. It was funny until you realised it wasn't. Because behind every joke was someone trying to stretch a paycheck that suddenly didn't stretch nearly as far as it had the year before. For millions of Americans, inflation wasn't a graph. It wasn't an economic debate. It wasn't a cable news argument. It was standing in a supermarket wondering which item had to go back on the shelf. It was opening the electric bill and hoping there'd been some kind of mistake. It was looking at a gas pump with the same expression people usually reserve for horror movies. One woman explained that she'd planned her retirement carefully. She'd done the math. She'd saved responsibly. Everything finally lined up. After decades of working, she'd retired for 10 months. Then inflation arrived. Fuel bills climbed dramatically. Living costs kept rising. The financial cushion she'd spent years building disappeared faster than free pizza at a college orientation. She had to go back to work. Think about how crushing that must feel. Retirement is supposed to be the finish line. It's the moment when you finally convince yourself you've earned a slower pace. You imagine relaxing, travelling, gardening, watching television during the middle of a Tuesday without feeling guilty. Instead, 10 months later, you're updating your resume again. That's heartbreaking. And unfortunately, she wasn't alone. Students were struggling. Retirees were struggling. Families living paycheck to paycheck were struggling. Anyone on a fixed income felt every increase immediately. Meanwhile, everyone else was trying to answer the same question. How exactly did we get here? Depending on who you asked, the answer changed dramatically. Some politicians confidently declared that inflation was entirely President Biden's fault. Others insisted it was Vladimir Putin's fault. Some argued it was the global supply chain. Others blamed corporate greed. At this point, I half expected someone's golden retriever to wander into the conversation and blame the vacuum cleaner. The strange thing was, almost everyone had at least a tiny piece of the puzzle, because inflation rarely has one single cause. It would certainly be convenient if it did. Imagine how simple economics would become one villain, one solution, roll credits. Unfortunately, reality almost never works that way. Inflation is usually the result of many different forces colliding at exactly the wrong time. And that's precisely what happened. It became the economic version of a perfect storm. To understand why prices exploded, you first have to understand one very basic idea: supply and demand. I know those two words instantly make most people feel like they've accidentally wandered into the first week of Economics 101. Stay with me, this part actually matters. Imagine something ridiculous. Let's say every person in America wakes up tomorrow and discovers they've won the lottery. Not a modest lottery, not enough money to replace the washing machine. We're talking $40 million each. Everyone, instantly. Now ask yourself one question. What happens next? People start buying things, lots of things. Some people buy houses, some buy yachts, some buy private islands. Personally, I'd probably spend an embarrassing amount of money on an enormous decorative frog statue. Not because I need one, nobody needs one. But once you're absurdly wealthy, need stops being part of the conversation. Now imagine there's only a handful of those giant frog statues left in existence. Suddenly, millions of newly wealthy people all want the same thing. Demand skyrockets, supply stays exactly the same, the price explodes. Congratulations! You've just created frog inflation or frogflation. Yes, that's ridiculous. No, I don't apologise. The important point is this: inflation happens whenever too many people are trying to buy too few things. That's the basic idea. Simple enough, but here's where politics enters the picture. Some people immediately looked at all the money Americans received during the pandemic and said, "See? That's the whole problem." Government stimulus checks, expanded unemployment benefits, economic rescue packages. People had more money. Therefore, inflation. At first glance, that explanation sounds convincing. More money, more spending, higher prices. Case closed. Except real life refused to cooperate with such a tidy explanation. Yes, government stimulus contributed. That's difficult to deny. People absolutely had more money available during the pandemic, but that's only one piece of a much larger story. Something else happened during those months that almost nobody had anticipated. People stopped going places, flights disappeared, restaurants closed, concerts vanished, vacations were cancelled, theatres emptied. Millions of people suddenly found themselves spending far less money than usual. Not because they wanted to save, because there was almost nothing to spend it on. Households accumulated enormous savings simply by staying home. Instead of buying plane tickets, they bought furniture. Instead of restaurants, they bought kitchen appliances. Instead of vacations, they bought exercise bikes, home offices, computers, televisions. Anything that made staying inside slightly less miserable. Demand shifted almost overnight. Entire industries slowed to a crawl. Others couldn't keep products on the shelves. Looking back, it's astonishing how quickly the economy rearranged itself. Even more astonishing, many of those emergency government programs also prevented something much worse. Without those rescue efforts, millions of workers would have lost income with no safety net. Businesses would have collapsed even faster. The economy might have slipped into a devastating recession. So yes, stimulus likely added some fuel to inflation. But it also prevented an entirely different disaster. Sometimes public policy isn't about choosing between good and bad. It's about choosing between bad and much, much worse. And that distinction matters. Because if we're going to understand why inflation became such a massive problem, we have to stop looking for a single villain. This wasn't one bad decision. It wasn't one politician. It wasn't one country. It wasn't one company. It was the result of multiple crises crashing into each other at exactly the same time. And unfortunately, the storm was only beginning. If the story had ended with people having a little extra money to spend, economists might have eventually sorted everything out with a few charts charts, a handful of interest rate adjustments, and enough PowerPoint presentations to put an insomniac into a medically fascinating coma. Unfortunately, the universe had other plans. Because demand was only half the equation, the other half, the part people often forget, is supply. Think back to our giant frog statues. Let's say everyone in America suddenly becomes incredibly wealthy and decides they absolutely must own one. Demand shoots through the roof overnight. Now imagine the company making those statues suddenly can't produce any more. Not because they don't want to, because the factory has shut down or raw materials aren't arriving. Shipping containers are stranded halfway across the world. Workers can't come in. Suddenly, those remaining statues become incredibly valuable. That's exactly what happens whenever supply shrinks while demand stays high. And yes, before you ask, if I somehow managed to buy every remaining frog statue before everyone else, I'd look less like a collector and more like the world's strangest investment banker. In fact, I'd probably spend the next decade insisting I'd revolutionize the decorative amphibian market. I didn't buy frog statues, I'd tell people. I diversified. It's amazing what confidence can do. People will believe almost anything if you say it while wearing an expensive suit. Now, here's where reality became much messier than any economics textbook could have predicted. Because COVID didn't simply keep people at home. It disrupted the machinery that keeps the entire global economy running. Factories slowed down, some shut entirely. Shipping routes became congested. Ports backed up. Deliveries that normally took weeks suddenly took months. Every delay created another delay somewhere else. Imagine trying to bake a cake when someone forgets the flour. Then the eggs arrive late, the oven breaks. And halfway through mixing everything together, someone walks into the kitchen and steals your mixing bowl. That's basically what happened to global supply chains. Nothing arrived when it was supposed to. One of the clearest examples was bicycles. Now, I realise bicycles aren't normally the first thing people think about when discussing worldwide economic crises. They're somewhere between garden hoses and extension cords on the excitement scale. But bicycles turned out to be the perfect example. During lockdowns, people wanted to exercise. Gyms were closed. Parks became crowded. Suddenly, everyone wanted bikes. Demand exploded almost overnight. There was just one problem. Most bicycles sold in America were manufactured overseas, particularly in China, where pandemic shutdowns had dramatically slowed production. So stores suddenly found themselves in an impossible situation. Customers kept walking through the door. The bikes weren't showing up. Retailers sold almost everything they had. Eventually, bike shops across the country looked almost empty. One shop owner admitted he had only a single bicycle left. Another was asked whether he'd ever seen anything like this before. His answer, never. And perhaps my favourite consequence of the shortage came from another bicycle dealer who explained that customers had completely abandoned their usual preferences. Men who might once have insisted on a specific colour suddenly looked at bright pink or purple bicycles and simply shrugged. Whatever, it's a bike! That's inflation in one sentence. When supply gets tight enough, dignity quietly packs its bags and leaves. The shortage even managed to accomplish something politicians have struggled with for generations. It erased at least one gender stereotype. Apparently, scarcity is surprisingly progressive. Of course, some products became dramatically more expensive than bicycles. Gasoline, for instance. Now there's a substance capable of ruining your morning before you've even finished your coffee. Fuel prices had already been climbing. Then another major event shook the world. Russia invaded Ukraine. Let's be clear about something. The war didn't begin inflation. Prices had already been rising before the invasion. Time is stubborn that way. Events generally cannot cause things that already happened. That's less economics and more how calendars work. What the invasion absolutely did do was make an already difficult situation much worse. Global energy markets were disrupted. Countries reduced purchases of Russian oil. Fuel prices surged even higher. Food prices also came under additional pressure. The result? People pulling into gas stations with the emotional stability of contestants on a reality dating show. One young driver summed it up perfectly. He just bought his very first car. He filled the tank with $20. The fuel gauge barely moved. The disbelief on his face suggested he'd just discovered gravity, had started charging admission. Honestly, I felt for him. There's something uniquely insulting about watching $20 disappear while your gas gauge responds with I appreciate the gesture. I'm fairly certain gas station employees spent much of that summer performing unofficial therapy sessions. Sir, I understand, no, the pump isn't broken. Yes, it really does cost that much. And no, screaming at me will not lower global oil prices. Meanwhile, politicians kept searching for someone to blame. Corporate greed became another favourite explanation. Now, companies absolutely were reporting enormous profits. Many raised prices aggressively. Some clearly took advantage of the public expectation that everything was becoming more expensive. That much was real. And it was frustrating. But here's the important distinction. Most economists didn't believe corporate greed actually started inflation because corporations didn't suddenly wake up 2 years earlier and discover greed for the first time. Businesses have always wanted to maximize profits. That's literally their job. Expecting corporations not to pursue higher profits whenever possible is a bit like expecting your dog to discover personal boundaries. Given the opportunity, it's probably going to make some deeply questionable decisions. Greed wasn't new. The environment simply made it easier to get away with higher prices. That's an important difference. So by this point, we'd accumulated quite the list. Pandemic shutdowns, government stimulus, changes in consumer spending, supply chain disruptions, labour shortages, energy shocks, the war in Ukraine, corporate pricing, every single one contributed in some way. Which is why anyone confidently declaring, I know the one thing that caused inflation, was almost certainly oversimplifying an incredibly complicated situation. Real economies are messy. They don't fit neatly into campaign slogans. Unfortunately, understanding the problem and solving it are two very different things. Eventually, everyone's attention turned toward one institution, the Federal Reserve. Now, central banking isn't exactly thrilling dinner conversation. If someone leans over at a party and says, so, what are your thoughts on monetary tightening? You have every right to pretend you've just remembered an urgent appointment somewhere else. Still, the Federal Reserve plays an enormously important role. Its job is to help keep the economy stable. One of its biggest tools is interest rates. Here's the simplified version. When borrowing money becomes more expensive, people generally borrow less. Businesses invest a little more cautiously. Consumers spend a little less. Demand cools. Prices eventually begin stabilising. It's not magic. It's more like carefully adjusting the thermostat in a house that's become unbearably hot. Sorry's rates enough, and spending slows. Sorry them too much. And the economy risks sliding into recession. That's why central banking often feels less like science and more like trying to land an airplane during a thunderstorm, while half the instruments are malfunctioning. In hindsight, many economists believe the Federal Reserve waited too long before raising interest rates. Its chairman, Jerome Powell, eventually acknowledged as much. Initially, officials believed inflation was temporary, a short-term consequence of pandemic disruptions. The expectation was simple. Supply chains would recover, factories would reopen, shipping would normalise, prices would settle down naturally. That was the textbook answer. The problem was, the pandemic had already torn the textbook into tiny little pieces. Nothing behaved normally. Factories didn't recover as quickly as expected. Supply problems lasted much longer. Gottsaumer demand remained surprisingly strong. The standard economic models simply didn't match reality anymore. To be fair, this wasn't a mistake unique to the Federal Reserve. Many respected economists reached the same conclusion. So did many investors. So did plenty of financial commentators. One of the loudest confidently declared inflation would prove temporary. Months later, he returned with a dramatically different opinion. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the confidence. Now, inflation suddenly seemed to be everywhere. Every aisle, every store, every receipt. Watching that reversal was almost impressive. It takes genuine talent to perform a public U-turn at highway speed. Still, it's difficult to blame people too harshly. The truth is almost everyone underestimated just how long these problems would last. And once inflation gathers momentum, it develops a dangerous habit. People begin expecting prices to rise. Workers ask for higher wages. Businesses face higher labour costs. Companies raise prices further. Employees then need even larger raises. policies. The cycle feeds itself, expectations become reality. That's why economists pay such close attention not only to actual inflation, but to what people believe inflation will be, because confidence itself becomes part of the equation, and unfortunately, confidence was becoming harder to find. So after all of that, after the pandemic disrupted the global economy, after consumers changed the way they spent money, after factories slowed down, after supply chains tangled themselves into knots, after energy prices surged, after a war made an already difficult situation even worse, everyone was left asking the same question. Now what? Naturally, attention shifted toward the Federal Reserve. If inflation had become America's biggest economic headache, then the Fed was suddenly expected to be the doctor. Although, if we're being honest, it was a bit like asking someone to perform heart surgery while blindfolded because half the medical textbooks had caught fire. The Fed's primary tool remained interest rates. Ride them high enough and borrowing becomes more expensive. Businesses slow expansion, consumers delay purchases, demand cools. Eventually, prices are supposed to stabilise. That's the theory. The challenge was figuring out exactly how much tightening the economy could handle. Rise rates too slowly, inflation keeps climbing, ride them too aggressively, you risk pushing the economy into a recession. It's one of those situations where nobody congratulates you for almost getting it right. You either land the plane or everyone notices. Jerome Powell tried reassuring Americans that the Federal Reserve understood exactly what it was doing. Initially, officials talked about engineering what economists like to call a soft landing. It's a pleasant phrase, a comforting phrase. It sounds like a feather drifting gently onto a pillow. Nobody objects to a soft landing. Then something changed. The language became less confident. Instead of promising a soft landing, Powell started talking about something slightly different, a softish landing. Softish. That tiny little suffix somehow carried an astonishing amount of anxiety because there are certain words in life that absolutely should never end with ish. You don't want your surgeon saying, the operation was successful-ish. You don't want your airline pilot announcing, we've landed-ish. You definitely don't want your dentist telling you, I removed the correct tooth-ish. There are moments where precision is comforting. This was one of them. Still, the truth was obvious. Nobody had complete certainty. Not the politicians, not Wall Street, not economists, not television commentators. Everyone was trying to navigate circumstances unlike anything they'd experienced before. There simply wasn't a reliable roadmap. Economic models that had worked for decades suddenly struggled to explain what was happening. The pandemic had rewritten the rules faster than anyone could update the manual. And perhaps the biggest unanswered question remains surprisingly simple. Was inflation mostly caused by demand or mostly caused by supply? Because the answer determined almost everything. If consumers simply had too much money chasing too few products, then higher interest rates could cool spending, problem solved eventually. But if the bigger issue was supply, if factories remained disrupted, if shipping remained unreliable, if war continued disrupting energy and food markets, then the Federal Reserve's influence became much smaller. Interest rates cannot reopen overseas factories. Interest rates cannot end wars. Interest rates cannot magically untangle shipping containers backed up at ports around the world. As amusing as it might be to imagine Jerome Powell personally leading an army of economists into a conflict zone armed only with spreadsheets and cautious optimism, that has never really been the Federal Reserve's job description. Which meant everyone faced an uncomfortable reality. Some parts of inflation simply weren't under anyone's immediate control. That uncertainty didn't stop politicians from trying to reassure the public. President Biden repeatedly emphasized that inflation was his top domestic priority. He also attempted to express empathy for struggling Americans. Unfortunately, he chose an unfortunate phrase. He told Americans, I know you can taste it. Now, I completely understand what he meant. He meant people could feel inflation affecting every part of daily life, but taste it is not the phrase you want connected to economic hardship. Inflation is many things. It should never sound like a menu item. Still, there was a reason leaders kept emphasizing optimism. Inflation isn't driven only by prices. Expectations matter too. If people become convinced prices will continue rising forever, their behavior changes. Workers ask employers for larger raises. Businesses anticipate higher labour costs, companies increase prices ahead of time, consumers rush to buy before things become even more expensive. Those expectations begin feeding themselves, inflation becomes partly psychological, confidence, or the lack of it, starts influencing reality. That's one reason the Federal Reserve eventually enacted its largest interest rate increase in decades. The message was clear. They were serious. Whether those actions would be enough, only time would tell. Fortunately, there were at least a few encouraging signs. Gasoline prices had begun easing slightly. Some longer-term inflation expectations showed modest improvement. Many economists believed the worst of the inflation surge would eventually fade over the following year or so. But there was one enormous problem with that hopeful prediction. A year or even 18 months is a very long time when you're already struggling to afford groceries. Economic forecasts often sound reassuring from a distance. They'll improve next year. Wonderful. That doesn't help someone standing in a supermarket today wondering whether they can afford both milk and cereal. Those aren't abstract economic decisions. Those are deeply personal ones. One mother described grocery shopping with her children. She explained how she'd stand in line quietly calculating every item, mentally adding prices, estimating taxes, trying desperately to keep the total below what she could afford. Sometimes she'd have to put products back. Her children noticed. Her oldest daughter quietly started putting things back herself, not because anyone asked, because she'd learned they couldn't afford everything. That image stayed with me. Children shouldn't become amateur budget analysts before they're old enough to drive. Kids belong in grocery stores, doing what generations of children have always done, running toward that giant bin filled with rubber balls for absolutely no reason. Picking one up, dropping it, watching three more bounce away, creating exactly the amount of harmless chaos their exhausted parents secretly expected. That's childhood, not silently helping decide which groceries remain affordable. Moments like that remind us why inflation isn't merely an economic statistic, it's lived experience. Every percentage point represents real families making harder decisions, real retirees returning to work, real students stretching every dollar. Real parents quietly sacrificing so their children don't have to. That's why any long-term solution also has to include helping the people carrying the heaviest burden right now, targeted assistance for lower-income families. Support that reaches people who genuinely need it, programs designed carefully enough to avoid unnecessarily increasing inflation while still protecting vulnerable households. Ideas like refundable child tax credits, expanded rental assistance. Policies intended to keep families housed while easing financial pressure. Those conversations aren't simple. Reasonable people disagree, but helping struggling families through an extraordinarily difficult period shouldn't feel controversial, especially when the hardship is so visible, because despite everything we've discussed tonight, all the supply curves, all the demand curves, all the debates over monetary policy, it's important not to lose sight of the people behind the numbers. Economics often has a way of making human stories disappear beneath graphs. But those stories are the entire point. Inflation isn't merely about percentages. It's about parents, retirees, workers, students, families trying to maintain a sense of normal life while everything around them quietly becomes more expensive. The good news, if there is any, is that history suggests inflation eventually does come down. Not overnight, not magically, usually through some difficult combination of patience, recovering supply chains, careful monetary policy, and time. Time is frustrating. It rarely moves at the speed we'd prefer, but economies, like people, often heal gradually. The challenge is making sure people can endure the healing process. And if there is one final lesson to take away from this whole bizarre journey, it's probably this. Whenever someone confidently insists inflation has one single cause or one unbelievably simple solution, you should immediately become suspicious. Complex problems rarely have bumper sticker answers. This one certainly doesn't. It's a story involving a global pandemic, government stimulus, shifting consumer behaviour, broken supply chains, energy shocks, war, corporate pricing, monetary policy, and ordinary families trying to make it through another week. That's a lot of moving pieces, far too many for any single slogan to explain. Still, I suppose there is one investment I remain completely confident about: those giant frog statues. Remember those? Throughout everything we've discussed, they've quietly become the greatest financial asset imaginable. There were only 3, then I bought one, then another, then... Why stop there? I bought the last one too. That's right. I cornered the decorative frog market. Am I an economist? Not particularly. Am I a central banker? Absolutely not. But am I now the undisputed Warren Buffett of giant ornamental frogs? Without question. Should millions of Americans suddenly become obsessed with oversized bronze amphibians, I'll be ready. History may remember this inflationary era for many things: the pandemic, the supply chain, gas prices, interest rates, economic uncertainty, families struggling to stretch every paycheck. But if someday scholars gather to discuss the greatest investment decisions ever made, I trust they'll eventually arrive at the same unavoidable conclusion. Someone else may have mastered Wall Street. Someone else may have predicted interest rates. Someone else may have understood monetary policy better than anyone alive. But when it came to giant frog statues, I absolutely nailed it.